I heard the Prime Minister on multiple occasions say that there will be guardrails to this relationship. I never heard anyone specify what they are. Minister, what are the guardrails? My question with respect was about the guardrails. Our own Prime Minister in April qualified it as the biggest security threat to Canada. So far, you haven't provided any specific answer.
In our interview yesterday, where we heard firsthand what Chinese transnational repression looks like in Canada, a Liberal minister was asked to explain the alleged guardrails behind its new engagement with Beijing. As much as he tried to talk his way out of the question, Vassy Kapelos refused to let him sidestep the issue, which is now leading to potential consequences with the United States.
Let's take a look.
You were alongside the Prime Minister for most of that trip internationally, where the overarching goal was essentially to diversify the markets that we are able to send our exports to. China got a lot of attention given our history with that country. And so on that note, I listened to Minister Champagne just a moment ago talk about eyes wide open. I heard the Prime Minister on multiple occasions say that there will be guardrails to this relationship as we try to amplify trade with China. I never heard anyone specify what they are. Minister, what are the guardrails?
Thanks, you too. Well, if you look at China, our second largest trading partner, it's very important that we continue to engage with China. Very successful trip. We've been working with them, to negotiate agriculture access. In fact, over $7 billion of agriculture access for canola, for seafood, for beef. In fact, our very first shipment of beef is already out there now. Canola's out there as well. And so it's very important that we continue to open up access for our producers, for our workers, but also about EVs. That's very important as well. Especially being an MP in Ontario, speaking to workers. Stellantis is in my riding, 3,000 people laid off. Speaking to those workers, they asked me, they just say, we want to build cars. We don't care who we build them for. We just want to build cars. And so this is very important in terms of attracting joint venture opportunities between Chinese and Canadian companies to help build those cars in Canada.
Okay. Number one, he didn't talk about guardrails at all. Number two, China being our second largest trading partner. So we've addressed this on multiple occasions, but we are happy to continue to address this. So that sounds nice to the average Liberal voter, and they may think that China is at a close second to the United States, but they're not. It's something in the neighborhood of over $400 billion in difference in the amount of trade that we do with China to the United States.
Well, I mean, the United States is right next door. You don't need a boat. You don't need a plane. You can just ship stuff down there with a transport truck. In order to get it to China, you need either a boat or a plane. They're right there.
Well, the major difference too is the vast majority of the trade that we deal with China is importing.
That's right. I mean, if you've got a kid in the house, look at most of their toys. Most of them say made in China.
Yeah. How many toys in China do you think say made in Canada, everybody? Like, let's just drop the BS for a minute and call it what it is. This is just blatant spin, and the minister is hoping that Vassy just ignores the question and then moves on. But then he talks about, our canola's over there right now. Yeah, our canola has been there this whole time. It's just been more expensive. That's the problem. And that has been the problem. So yes, it's still over there, but they're buying less of it because of how expensive it's been.
Which means less of it gets shipped.
Right. And then he says, EVs, this is great. And a bunch of people got laid off at Stellantis. Yeah, whose fault was that? But let's just pause there. There is no plan for China to make EVs in Canada. They've said, we've thought about it. They said, maybe we'll do it. But that isn't something that is actually on the table.
It's to my understanding that they'll be producing them in China and then shipping them whole to Canada.
Correct. So there's actually going to be no new building car jobs as a result of this EV deal, despite what the Liberals will have you think. But the most important question is, and again, considering our history with China, considering What we heard from Yao Zhang yesterday in our, frankly, it was the most incredible interview I think we've ever done. I had a real hard time keeping it together throughout the whole thing because she was getting so emotional talking about how she was treated by China and the PRC and the United Front Work Department agents that are in Canada coming after her, that went after her family, that went after her reputation, that doxed her entire family. It's no joke. But the Liberals would just say, oh, you know, trust me, bro.
And I appreciate, Minister, the economic case, right, as you lay it out for more trade with China. But my question with respect was about the guardrails that your government is planning to put in place. I know our audience and you will be familiar with the fact that in April, the Prime Minister, in response to a question in the election debate about what is the greatest security threat facing Canada, his answer was China. So the question around guardrails pertains to that. Like, what guardrails is your government going to put in place to help navigate this relationship so that we do not suffer as a result of, more trade with China?
So part of the agreements that we signed on the ground in China was law enforcement collaboration, cooperation with each other to keep our community safe. And so I think that's very important for those watching so they understand, what we're doing there. We're making sure there's partnerships on energy, on agriculture, on consumer goods, but also, of course, public safety and law enforcement is very, very important. We want to make sure that our citizens' safety is never compromised. And so, going in with eyes wide open, as you said, it's very important to our government. But, as the Prime Minister said in Davos, we need to see the world for what it is, not what we wish it to be. And so we need to approach it very pragmatically and constructively, and that's exactly what our government is doing.
Why does Canada need to partner with China in matters of policing and crime?
Especially because if you've watched our channel, if you read Sam Cooper's material on the Bureau, if you've heard Sam Cooper in his testimony, both in Parliament and on any of the interviews that he's done, you will know that the biggest offender when it comes to transnational crime from China is the Chinese government. How does collaboration between our law enforcement agencies going to stop that?
Well, and I could understand if they said, oh, we signed an extradition treaty.
Well, the only issue with an extradition treaty is as long as that prohibits China from extraditing people that have immigrated here and are now Canadian citizens that they want to remove, like Zhou Te, like Yao Zhang, that are speaking the truth about China and trying to let everybody know exactly what's going on.
Yeah, and that would be a huge issue if you are, again, extraditing people who are now Canadian and the Chinese government is accusing them of having committed a crime in China. Are they going to send those people back? I certainly hope not.
The other concern I have, and this is why we need details on this, is what exactly do you mean by collaboration between law enforcement? Because sometimes what that means is sharing of data.
Well, and sometimes it means sharing of training. We have a friend who's a police officer, and I recall that and you have to forgive me because it was a little while ago, but either they would send the officers with police dogs over to Buffalo to train, or the folks from Buffalo would come over to the Canadian side to train their police dogs. I don't remember which way it went, but the training is something, maybe I can understand, but not with China.
No. And I don't want any of our data going over there because the last thing that they need is more data on our citizens.
But again, with respect, Minister, I'll reference comments made, by the Liberal Party, by the government at the time, when you introduced the Indo-Pacific strategy, whose, primary aim was to develop a strategy to counter the increasing power of China. China's rise as a global actor, Melanie Joly said at the time, is reshaping the strategic outlook of every state in the region. It seeks to shape the global environment into one that is more permissive to interests and values that increasingly depart from ours. The China of 1970, she said, is not the China of today. China is an increasingly disruptive global power. Are you telling me that more cooperation between law enforcement agencies is going to counter that or protect Canadians from the impact of that?
Kudos to Vashi in this interview, because she's not only bringing up points that we've been bringing up, that Canadians have been bringing up, the fact that Mark Carney has said that China is the biggest security threat to Canada, that other Liberal ministers have brought up the same fact in the past. And what does Carney do? Well, you know, we need to commit to mutual respect of each other's government systems. I'm sorry, I can't have respect for a country whose whole intent of government is suppression, which is compliance from its people to surrender their will to the party. How do you have mutual respect for somebody like that? You can have arm's length understanding and quote unquote respect. Like you can respect the fact that we could not go up at against the Chinese military. You can have that type of respect, but I'm not going to sit here and pretend, oh, communism, yeah, that's great, I respect that. No, especially not when they treat their citizens like we've heard from Joe Tay, like we've heard from Yao Zhang. But kudos to Vashi for not letting this go and staying on this like a dog in a bone.
Well, those conversations are very important to keep our community safe, and so dialogue is very important between two countries to make sure that public safety is paramount. But at the same time, it's about economic opportunities. As you know, a year ago, the situation was very different. U.S. being our largest trading partner, we promised Canadians that we diversify our trading partners. We promised Canadians that we continue to unlock opportunities for our industries. Our industries are asking for us to do this, and that's exactly why we made sure that we made progress on our relationship with China on the economic front. But you look at what we're doing on the cultural front as well. China agreed to lift visas for Canadians that are traveling there. China agreed to encourage more group travel to Canada, which supports millions of dollars in tourism for small and mid-sized operators here in Canada. And so we're making sure that we're creating opportunities, but it all comes down to affordability. Here at the Cabinet Planning Forum, we're talking about affordability. We're talking about building Canada strong. We're talking about our sovereignty, because this is what's important. This is what we hear from Canadians. They want jobs. They want to be able to produce world-class products. The world wants what Canada has, and that's why we're out there pitching for it.
Certainly, I understand, like I said, the economic imperative for it. I understand, as you also point out, that the United States has drastically changed its behavior. But China has not, right? China still does the same things that it did 3 years ago, so much so that our own Prime Minister in April qualified it as the biggest security threat to Canada. So far, you haven't provided any specific answer as to, as you amplify this trading relationship, which I, again, understand the imperative to do so, like, how are you going to guard against what our own Prime Minister has identified as the biggest security threat to our country? There are no specifics that you have provided tonight to provide assurances to Canadians on that front.
I really like this point that Vashi made. She says, sure, the U.S. has changed their behavior, but China hasn't. China is the same old interfering conglomerate superpower that they are today, that they were 3 years ago, that they were 5 years ago, that they were when they abducted the two Michaels, that they were when they threatened our politicians because of the way they voted, that they were when they had, or maybe still have, all of the police stations across the country that are harassing Chinese diaspora folks. This is not any different. And that's the major point here, is they have not changed their behavior. The Liberals want everybody to think, well, the U.S. has changed and so has China. There is no evidence to support that statement that China has changed their behavior on this at all.
Well, as I said, Vashi, I mean, the assurances are in the agreements that we've signed between dialogue, between having conversations with law enforcement. Our countries are having diplomacy back and forth. This is something that we've committed to back in our election. In May, having the first conversation with my counterpart, Minister Wong, to reopen the Joint Economic Commission that sat dormant for 8 years. You need to be able to have dialogue. In order to have, you're never going to have agreements fully 100%, but you need to be able to have conversations with nations around the world for the opportunities of Canadians. That's what we're going to continue to stay focused on.
Yeah, I'm certainly not intimating that you shouldn't have any of those conversations. My question was more about, the language that your government has employed around guardrails and how there is a lack of specifics. On the agreements that you're referencing, I had a question particularly around energy, because there is some language in the MOU that would leave, I think, the reader with the impression that there will be greater access allowed to China in some strategic sectors, in particular oil and gas. Is your government okay with a Chinese state-owned company controlling shares, for example, in the oil patch in various companies or operations?
So currently there are joint ventures, in LNG Canada 1 in Kitimat, BC. PetroChina was involved in that project, obviously a minority stake, and that's something that we're open to considering. If you look at 7 different LNG projects in development, that part of the world is fast growing. They need more energy, they need more agriculture goods, and guess what? Canada has both, and so we'll make sure that we continue to promote our resources for the betterment of all Canadians.
I find it very interesting that the Liberals are just so blasé about China having shares in our energy companies. But there is a Liberal-backed petition when Americans, foreigners, have a stake in Post Media, which is one of our media companies. And as Ryan explained in the video a few weeks ago, they're non-voting shares.
Yeah. And the fact that the minister said, oh, we're open to it. That's what I heard. We're open to state-owned oil and gas companies in China having controlling interests over this type of resource in our own natural resources and energy sector. That's concerning. Again, let's go back to what did Canada actually get in this deal?
Nothing. The canola, yes, there was issues with the canola, but you'll have to forgive me, I forget which pundit it was, had said that mainly affects Western Canada, which is already voting Conservative. So you're not getting any more votes by having the canola farmers, the tariffs off the canola, but now you're losing support in the Golden Horseshoe because of the auto issue.
Now, don't get us wrong. It's a good thing that the tariffs they're not being eliminated. That's one of the big problems, but they're coming down on canola because our canola farmers were being hit pretty hard there. So that's a good thing. The problem is you didn't get them down to zero. And what it sounds like you gave China is, okay, so now we're considering giving you controlling shares in oil and gas companies in Canada. You get to have full market access to your EVs. You get to have access to Destination Canada, which is our government tourism board. And we're going to have a collaboration with the state propaganda organization in China that filters down to the United Front Work Department that's already involved in a lot of clandestine news distribution around the world. So they get that. They're getting more uranium. What kind of a master negotiator is this, folks? Because we didn't get a lot here.
Well, because Canada was in the weaker position.
Right. Which is the whole part about Carney's speech in Davos about we shouldn't be trying to, put ourselves in a position where we're subservient to superpowers.
What did he just do?
Except you did that literally right before Davos. So what the hell are you talking about? Now, the other thing that we need to chat about is it's funny because in our interview yesterday with this incredibly brave lady, Yao Zheng, she talked about the fact that China has designs for the world. And they're not waiting to do them. They're in the process of doing them. And they want influence everywhere. And they would love to control Canada. And she has talked about that. Well, now it seems like President Donald Trump is talking about it as well. Donald Trump put this up on Truth Social. And this is what he posted this morning. If Governor Carney thinks he is going to make Canada a quote-unquote drop-off port for China to send goods and products into the United States, he is sorely mistaken. China will eat Canada alive, completely devour it, including the destruction of their business social fabric and general way of life. If Canada makes a deal with China, it will immediately be hit with a 100% tariff against all Canadian goods and products coming into the USA. Thank you for your attention to this matter, President Donald J. Trump. And he cites an article here, and it's by justthenews.com, and it says, Deal with the Devil, How Canada's New Partnership with China Could Backfire. So let's take a quick look at that.
Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's new plan to cozy up to Beijing betrays his calls to preserve the quote-unquote international order he says is under threat from Donald Trump, and Canada's economic dependence on the United States may cause his plan to backfire. In a speech to the global elite at Switzerland's Davos resort town this week, Carney warned attendees that the, quote, rules-based order, end quote, established by the United States and its allies in the wake of the Second World War is fraying amid the re-emergence of great power conflict, principally the rivalry between China and America. Quote, every day we're reminded that we live in an era of great power rivalry, end quote, Carney said. Quote, that the rules-based order is fading, that the strong can do what they can and the weak must suffer what they must, end quote. The Liberal Canadian politician made no secret of his purpose. The New Deal, which represented Canada, quote-unquote, recalibrating its relationship with China, would set up the country for the, quote, New World Order, end quote, one in which the United States ally would try to distance itself from its southern neighbor. When Carney left Beijing, the new quote-unquote strategic partnership committed China and Canada to increase trade and investments, as well as closer collaboration on the very quote-unquote global governance that Carney says President Trump has abandoned. The two countries also promised close cooperation on law enforcement, focusing on drug trafficking and cybercrime, and to increase cultural exchanges. Both issues could come back to bite Carney at home, senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, Brent Sadler, told Just the News. Quote, Prime Minister Carney's trip to Beijing makes no sense, end quote, Sadler told the Just the News No Noise TV show on Thursday. Quote, it might feel good at the moment to try to stick his finger in what he thinks is President Trump's eye, end quote, said Sadler. Quote, the reality is he went to a country of an authoritarian communist regime that doesn't acknowledge or respect religious freedoms, personal rights to freedom of speech. They have a social credit system that you get judged on every day in access to services, let alone medical services and everything else, end quote. He added, quote, it's everything that's antithetical to what the Canadian people seem to think and embrace in a liberal society. Makes no sense, end quote. China's human rights record ignored by Carney. Indeed, the United Nations, a key governance body of the rules-based order that Carney supports, found in 2022 that China was responsible for committing, quote, serious human rights violations, end quote, against the Uyghur minority group in the eastern region of Xinjiang.
And that doesn't really stop there, because just a couple of hours ago, President Trump dropped one more post. He says, the last thing the world needs is to have China take over Canada. It's not going to happen or even come close to happening. Thank you for your attention to this matter, President Donald J. Trump. And this is what people are concerned of, because it doesn't sound like that there's any guardrails at all that the Liberal government has put on China. It sounds like it's open season. And this is what Yao Zhang had said in our interview yesterday. She said that China's price in almost all things with all countries when they're doing these new trade deals is their national security. You must surrender your national security to China in order to actually get any economic benefits from China. And as we go on, that sounds like exactly what's happened, because they're saying, well, there's going to be collaboration with law enforcement. Whoop-de-doo, Basil. That doesn't sound like there's going to be any curbing of any of China's activity in Canada. And they've said, oh, well, we're opening visas for people to come into China. Just because they can get into China doesn't mean that China is going to allow them to leave. That's a very different thing. So this is something that is quite alarming. It's predictable, But it's alarming nonetheless that the Liberal government is just going in here saying, yeah, well, whatever. We're really only interested in the money. And that is what I got from Sudu's answers. He was asked about national security. He was asked about these guardrails. And he's like, well, you know, that's one thing. But the real thing is all the economic benefits that we're going to get.
Right, because again, it's what the Liberals constantly do, which is they make a deal or they do something over here, and us as conservatives are like, hey, that's a problem. And then they go, no, 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 everybody, look over here. Look at this shiny new thing over here.
And the other problem that's going on right now is the Liberal supporters, they're viewing any criticism towards this as fear-mongering and as conspiracy theory. Never mind the fact that there's folks all over the world that are pointing this and saying, this doesn't feel right. This is a problem. And it's not just Donald Trump saying it. It's not just Pierre Poilievre saying it. It's not just the conservatives saying it. You have academics, you have people that study this thing, and you have folks from around the world. And most importantly, you have people that have lived in this country for half of their lives and are now Canadian, and they're trying to sound the alarm bells. So maybe it's not conspiracy theory. Maybe it's a legitimate warning to what we need to be really careful of as Canada when dealing with superpowers like China that aren't interested in freedom. They're interested in one thing and one thing only, and that's more power.